Welcome back. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 38, which discusses highway safety and vehicle extrication. Now, this class goes hand in hand with a practical aspect. I believe that every good EMT class should have a hands-on vehicle extrication day. So I know every class I do my best to have a hands-on portion. This teaches you how to interact with fire departments a lot and how things really operate hands-on. So this is important that we actually do the hands-on part of this, but there are a lot of classroom things that we should be talking about so that we can keep this stuff in mind when we're actually going to the hands-on portion. So without further ado, let's head into this. So going into operations that all emergency vehicles really should be taking into consideration on the highway, and we'll focus on a few things that ambulances in particular should be mindful of. So in terms of what kills EMTs, the vast majority of things that actually kill EMTs happen with something that has to do with the road, whether that's getting in a vehicle accident while you are in your vehicle and driving, or you are in an accident involved while you're operating on a emergency scene. So they are one of our biggest scene safety hazards. You really want to limit the amount of time that you are actually operating on a road, because people who drive by accident scenes don't pay attention to what they're actually driving to. They want to be paying attention to the cool thing that's on the side of the road. So they aren't aware of their surroundings. So keep all that in mind, that these are very dangerous calls, and we want to limit the amount of time that we are outside of our vehicle or even have our vehicle parked on these scenes. So keeping that in mind, we really need to limit the amount of resources that we call for on scenes on highways. Try to have the minimum necessary amount of vehicles and personnel there. The less vehicles you have, the less chance of an accident happening. Same with the amount of people. That being said, please don't neglect to bring in the proper resources. You're going to have some resources there, but don't call for 5 ambulances when you only have 2 patients. That's really what we're getting at there, is know the resources that you need and call for the appropriate ones. So when you are the first arriving unit on scene, your job is to protect the scene until it's taken over by another vehicle. This is called blocking. You use your vehicle and you kind of park it at an angle going away from the scene, and so you're providing a barrier between the scene and oncoming traffic. If oncoming traffic's not paying attention and they veer into the scene, hopefully they hit the vehicle that's blocking the scene and they don't plow into you. Preferably, the blocking vehicle will be a fire truck. This is a few reasons. Number one, a fire truck is much bigger, so it provides a lot more blocking space. It's also heavier, so it's harder for a vehicle to hit it and have it roll because it's just too heavy to move. And also, when we are doing extrication and motor vehicle accidents, you want to have the fire trucks near the scene anyway. The ambulance, yes, should be close, but it doesn't have to be right on top of the operational things that are happening by extricating the patient. So preferably our blocking vehicles are fire apparatus, but if you are the first person to arrive on scene, whatever vehicle you have, your job initially is to use your vehicle to block the scene. If you happen to be blocking lanes of traffic, that is appropriate sometimes to block complete lanes of traffic down. Try to clear it as quickly as possible so that we can have traffic moving around. Blocking traffic is a very hard thing for us to do, both for the public gets very upset with us because they can't get places, but also responding units. If we're blocking traffic completely, it's very hard for more responding units to get to the scene just because there's a traffic backup. So keep that in mind, that we want to have flowing traffic whenever possible. So if you are the vehicle that's blocking, there are a few rules that we need to keep in mind. First one is turn your wheel so that the tires will be angled away from the scene. That way, if someone hits the rear of your vehicle and it happens to move your vehicle, it's turning away from the scene and not into you guys. Try to keep your vehicle at an angle So usually like a 45-degree angle, that provides the best level of protection. Again, you want to be putting a barrier between the scene and the oncoming traffic. So angles are the best. Make sure that your vehicle is far enough away from any dangers. Yeah, if the car's on fire, don't park your vehicle 5 feet away from the car. You might catch your own vehicle on fire. So make sure that you have dangers away from you. Same with like telephone poles. If you have wires that are down, don't go so close to the scene that you're driving over top of those wires. If you are the transporting ambulance, you need to keep in mind that you might have to leave that scene expeditiously to transport a trauma patient to the hospital. So make sure you have a clear pathway out of the scene. Preferably, ambulances should go past the scene a little bit and be one of the last vehicles in the line of apparatus. That way you can take off from the scene to head to the hospital. Also keep in mind that rescue apparatus has tools on it, and sometimes those tools have to be connected to the apparatus, such as hoses if the vehicle's on fire, or some extrication tools are controlled with pneumatics. So you have to keep in mind that fire needs to get kind of close to the vehicle with their own vehicle. So try to leave room for them coming in. So if you are the ambulance coming in and you are initially blocking the scene, stay back maybe 50, 100 feet from the scene when you park, and that allows room for a fire engine to get by you so that they can do their thing. So when we're talking about interstates, so these are closed off highways, really try to very much so limit the amount of resources on scene. Get your first ambulance and your first engine there, but everyone else, keep them as close as they can be without actually committing to the highway. So if there's a little gathering area just off of the on-ramp to the highway, that's really best. That way, if you need them, they should be there in the matter of a minute or two, but we aren't clogging up the interstate and putting even more vehicles on there, because number one, it's hard to get the vehicles off of there, and number two, interstates are incredibly dangerous just because of the high rates of speed that people are driving with. So that's a rule that we really want to keep in mind with interstates. As far as if you're on the scene in an interstate, you should be parking single file in the same direction. That way we can keep at least one lane open for passing vehicles. Again, traffic flow is a high priority, both keeping citizens driving and keeping traffic moving that way, but also, again, if this traffic's not moving at all, it's very hard for other responders to be able to get to an interstate. So as the first arriving unit, if that happens to be you, you are at first the incident commander. You are in charge of the entire scene until someone takes it over for you. So when you get there, confirm that it's in the right place. A lot of times the locations on roads are very murky. People don't know exactly where they are in the road, so they just call and say, oh, it's somewhere in this area. So confirm where it actually is. I've been sent several miles off of the 911 call before. I think my record is 3 miles up the road from where the dispatch actually sent me to. So it does happen. So make sure that you confirm that what you arrive to is what you're dispatched to, both in location and both in what you're seeing. Make sure you know how many patients there are so you get the appropriate resources coming towards you. Make sure that you see any hazards that might be coming on. When you have more apparatus come to you, that's when you need to have a good idea of where to park them. So use a good method to block the scene with your fire apparatus as they come, and also think about your exit points. Make sure that you leave room for you with an ambulance to maneuver out of that scene. So when you actually come up on a scene and you're getting out of your vehicle, make sure that you wear a high visibility vest. Most vehicles should have one on there. It's mandated for ambulances to have a high visibility vest on it. So whenever we're working anywhere near a street, make sure you have that vest on. Also be very cognizant of oncoming traffic. Just because you have your lights on doesn't mean that people are going to be thinking, oh, we need to give this ambulance or fire truck plenty of room. They might be driving 3 feet away from you. If you open up your door and try to step out, they could very easily hit you. So be aware of that. Make sure you look before you get out of your vehicle so that you aren't hit by a car. Also, park far enough away that you can operate around your vehicle in a safe zone. Again, if there's like wires down or something, you don't want to be parked right on top of those wires. You want to be able to have everything in your vehicle's zone be in the safe zone. Now you can place flares or traffic cones, and that will help direct traffic, especially if it's at night. Flares are a good idea to kind of shut off that one lane. People are pretty aware when they see flares, and they usually follow what flares do. But it's not something that will guarantee your safety. So just because you put out flares doesn't mean you can't forget about seeing safety. Also, at night, it's very important that we're not blinding oncoming traffic. And this is something that is very common to see, is you leave your emergency lights on all the way, and then you blind oncoming drivers, which then they can drive into your scene just because they can't see well. So when you park your vehicle at night, you should only have red and or amber lights flashing. Do not have any flashing white lights. Those white lights in the front of a light bar, those are called takedowns. Those are very blinding in particular. Most ambulances and most emergency vehicles have an option of primary and secondary emergency lights. So there'll be a switch, it'll say primary, and that bomb will say secondary. The secondary is meant for when you are parked at a scene. It will only have your necessary lights to identify your vehicle. So just some red lights usually around the corners of your vehicle. The primaries are the full shebang. That's what you want when you are driving down the road going to a call, and you want the white flashing lights to get people's attention. So when you're parked, try to flip it to secondary lights if your vehicle is equipped with that option. Also make sure that your headlights are off. Headlights alone, especially if they are have any high beams in them that are flashing back and forth, those can be very blinding to oncoming traffic. And we want oncoming traffic to be able to have the best visibility possible while still letting them know that we are there and we're not moving. So keep all that in mind. And also when you're lighting up the scene, our scene lights are very blinding. So try to be aware of that with oncoming traffic, that if you have scene lights pointed towards oncoming traffic, you're most likely going to be blinding them and they won't be able to see you well. Again, talking about interstates, if we're on the interstate, you really should be spending as little time as possible on the highway. In order to get to the call, you might actually have to drive past it going, say, northbound, and then hit a turnaround to head southbound to actually get to your scene. If you ever find yourself in need of using a turnaround, even if it's not an emergent situation, but you need to get to a non-emergency call and you need to use a turnaround, always turn your emergency lights on when you're slowing down to the turnaround, and then when you get on the new side and you're speeding up. So when you decelerate and when you're accelerating out of that turnaround, always have your emergency lights on. People don't gauge how fast they're going on the interstate very well, and so if you don't have your lights on, they'll just think that you're a normal vehicle driving normal speed, and then they're going to come up on you really fast, and it's going to be too late for them to actually brake in time. So emergency lights will let them know that something is going on there. You should not be in that lane. There are some special circumstances if you're on an interstate that you might be asked to access the scene going the wrong way down the interstate. So instances of this is when the scene is so bad that no traffic can get, say the scene's on the northbound side, no traffic can get past the scene on the northbound side, so all the traffic is shut down at the scene, and so emergency vehicles won't be able to access the scene from there. So they might ask you to go further north than the call and then go backwards, so go southbound in the northbound side to access the call. In my career, I can count on one hand the amount of times I've been asked to do this, and one of those times was almost fatally wrong for me. We'll discuss that in the next slide. So right here is a diagram of two different highways and how they interchange in the city of Syracuse. One time I was dispatched to a MVA, and it was on 81. This is 81 right here. And it was around right here on 81 northbound, so headed this way. And it blocked all traffic from this point backwards. So nothing could get past this point right here where the accident was, including emergency responders. So I was instructed to go on to 81 at this on-ramp right here. So go on 81, turn around, and then head southbound in the northbound side to get to the scene. I was told that this scene was shut down, or shut down the road completely. There would be no traffic coming. Well, the people who told us that were forgetting that there's an interstate right here called 690, and 690 has an on-ramp right here to 81. So I hop on here at about 2 a.m., turn around, and I'm coming down with all this traffic coming about 65 miles an hour directly at me. So know your district, and that's something that I wasn't thinking about either, that they said, oh, it's shut down completely. I thought, cool, we'll just hop on, there'll be no problems. Well, that happened to be a massive problem. So don't just trust that. Make sure that you think of your own safety as well. So I should have thought, hey, did you guys specifically shut down 690, which is feeding into me right here? Unfortunately, it was too late once I actually found out, and it's a miracle that I made it through getting to that call without getting in an accident myself, because cars were coming at me going 55, 65 miles an hour, and I was going 40 miles an hour going the wrong way, and there were a lot of blind curves in that area, so it's a miracle no one hit me. I think the only reason is because it was 3 a.m., so it wasn't much traffic. So that makes us think, is it safe to enter the highway scene? Which units are necessary to do the call without having more units than you need? And then, does the traffic, or can the traffic continue to flow, or does it need to be completely shut down? There are times when the scene is so big or so serious that the road needs to be shut down completely. So that's something that we need to communicate with police and say, we need this road shut down 100%, divert traffic somewhere else. That's something that they can do. We don't like doing it. It confuses a lot of people. But if it's needed because we need to be operating all over the road at that time, and we can't be thinking about cars going around us safely, that's something that we do have to be, that we can do, is completely shut down that road. So going into vehicle extrication, and like I said, a lot of this is more hands-on stuff. So keep that in mind, that you should really be reinforcing this with doing actual hands-on vehicle extrication with the fire department. This is a great team building exercise where the fire department gets to learn about our priorities as EMS providers with the patients, and we get to learn about the fire department and how they actually extricate our patients out. That way we can work better hand in hand when we actually have these calls happen. So some terminology that you should have a familiarization with. First one is cribbing and stabilization. One of the first priorities of the fire department is to stabilize the vehicle so it's not going to roll anywhere or move on us while we're working on it. So they do this a number of ways. One of the most basic ways is called cribbing. It's a bunch of really big wooden blocks that they can stack, and then they put it near the tires and they put it under the frame, and so the car is actually resting on the wooden blocks instead of the movable tires. So that's one way that they can do this. There's a bunch of other different tools that they can use, especially if the vehicle's on its side or on its roof. So just know that their first priority is to stabilize that vehicle so it doesn't actually move on us while we're operating in and around it. Next one is spreaders and cutters. So these are the actual tools that they use to get people out of vehicles. You might hear these things referred to as the jaws of life. So there are two different tools. The first one, spreaders, does exactly what you think. It spreads apart with incredible force. It's usually powered by hydraulics. So they spread metal apart and it can pop doors open. Cutters, on the other hand, will close and it will cut through metal. So spreaders and cutters are pretty basically named for what they do. Some other terms you might hear are A post and B post, and maybe C post and D post. So that refers to, if you think about your own vehicle in the window, you have that big bar between your windshield and your front window. That bar is your A post. There's metal underneath that, and that is part of your vehicle's structure. So that's the A post, and then the space between the front seats and the back seats, where there's that place in the window where there's no actual window, there's your B post, similar concept. And then as you have more rows in a vehicle, you just continue down the alphabet. So A post, B post, C post, and so on and so forth. When we're talking about damage to a vehicle, you can either refer to the side and location. So you can say front driver's side, or front driver's door, or passenger rear door, or the trunk of the vehicle, so you can refer to it as that, or you can use the clock. So the front of the vehicle would be 12 o'clock, the rear of the vehicle would be 6 o'clock, the passenger side would be 3, and the driver's side would be 9. So you can use either one to refer to damage. This comes in handy, especially when we're documenting our calls. We can say damage was to this area of the vehicle, which helps paint a picture for anyone reading it as to what the mechanism of injury was. So there will be a lot of times where you will be the first person on scene. And most of our MVAs are relatively minor. In fact, in the district that I work in full time, the fire department is not started to about half of our MVAs. They're only started when there is a confirmed injury or confirmed hazard on scene on the 911 call. If it's just I saw these two vehicles hit each other, I don't know if anyone's hurt, that doesn't start the fire department, but it does start an ambulance in the district that I work in full time. So if you are first on the scene and you don't see any obvious hazards, you can approach the vehicle. Remember, approach it cautiously, because just because you can't see any hazards from a distance, there might be a hazard that pops up as you're walking up to the vehicle. So be very aware of hazards. Check to see if there's any leaking fluids. If there are leaking fluids, that is a hazard. That's something that warrants the fire department to come mitigate. When you talk to your patient, make sure that the vehicle is actually parked. Some people panic and they don't forget to put their vehicle in park, and then they get out of their vehicle and it starts rolling away. So make sure the vehicle is parked, and then make sure the vehicle is turned off, and then remove the keys. So this will turn off all the electronics, so it reduces the risk of shock and or fire. Typically, I personally, when I remove the keys, I put it on top of the dash. That's a general place that a lot of responders put keys, so that if anyone's looking for the keys, check the top of the dash first. Sometimes patients want to take the keys with them, and just make sure that you coordinate with the police department on scene in case if the vehicle needs to be towed or moved, and make sure that they don't need the keys to do that. So just coordinate things with police, because police should be on every MVA that happens. So if they aren't there, make sure that they are coming. So actually extricating the patient. Only do this if you are trained and have the right tools to do this. So in New York State, for the most part, that is something that only fire departments are doing. So you can be an EMT with a fire department, and if you are trained to do that, then go ahead and do the rescue. But just because you are a trained firefighter and you're trained in vehicle extrication, if you show up on the ambulance and you don't have the proper protective gear, do not get into that vehicle or try to do something with the fire department when they arrive on scene. You have to have the right gear to do this. Otherwise, you put yourself in great danger. So when you arrive on scene, the scene size up is huge with MVAs because there's usually more than one patient. You need to find out if you have more than one patient that needs to be transported, because that requires more ambulances. Find out how injured they are to get a good quick sense of the sick or not sick, your good general impression of these patients. Find out if you need ALS coming for these patients. Find out if you need more fire apparatus because it's going to be a prolonged extrication. So find out a lot of your scene size up very quickly and use that information to guide what you do in the first couple minutes, because that's very crucial to how this call is going to go. Again, find out if you need extrication for the patient. And just because you have, say, one door is shut and you can't get it open, go to the other side. If the driver's side won't open up, see if the passenger side will open up, and then you can access your patient and or possibly have the patient come out via that door. So just because you have one side that you can't get someone out doesn't mean that that's the end all be all for this. Again, make sure you have your appropriate protective gear on. Anyone who is working near the vehicle needs to have full firefighting turnout gear on with cut-resistant gloves on. There's a lot of dangers with vehicles that have just been in a collision. You have broken glass places, you have sharp metal because it's bent off the vehicle, there's bloodborne pathogens hanging around, especially blood that you might not know until you are actually touching it. The vehicle can catch fire very quickly, there's dangerous chemicals leaking out of the vehicle, and there's other vehicles that are not paying attention to you that can strike you. So make sure you at least have your reflective vest on, and if you do not have full proper turnout gear, do not get into that vehicle. A good rule of thumb is look at what your peers on the scene are doing. If everyone's wearing a vest and you aren't, that's a good clue that you should put a vest on. On the flip side, some peers that you see might be lazy. So just because they don't have the mask and goggles on and proper gloves on, but you do, doesn't mean that you're in the wrong. A lot of people don't take full safety precautions. So generally, if you see that everyone's doing something that you're not, you probably should be doing it. But just because no one is doing what you're doing doesn't mean that you're in the wrong. So going into our actual patients. So when you extricate the patient, they're in a lot of hazardous zones as well. They are exposed to that broken glass that we're talking about. They're exposed to the sharp metal that we're talking about. They're exposed to the dangerous chemicals that we're talking about. One of the more profound things we see is the broken glass, especially when the fire department is actually working on the patient, because they are punching windows out, they're sawing glass, there's glass flying everywhere. So try to protect your patient the best you could. Try to put some sort of covering over the patient, whether that's a blanket or a firefighter's jacket or something like that. Try to cover their body and, if feasible, cover a lot of their face and make sure that they have protection of their eyes so that nothing gets where it shouldn't be on the patient, makes their injuries worse. You should protect their C-spine as soon as possible if you decide that that's indicated. So try to get a C-collar on that patient as soon as you can, and manual stabilization if needed. Use a backboard and or Stokes basket to remove the patient if needed, especially if you need to carry them a long way. Say they drove well off the road. You don't want a patient walking like that and you can't get the stretcher to them. So backboard and or Stokes basket will be a good thing to utilize to move your patient out there. Remember your lifting and moving skills and techniques. This is why we talked about all that at the start of class, because now is when knowing all of your devices really comes into play to decide how to move patients across odd terrain. Keep in mind that a few patients will need manual stabilization of the spine during extrication. And this is something that when I was a brand new EMT, I ended up having to do this on a vehicle that rolled going about 90 miles an hour when the patient wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and she was partially ejected, but the vehicle was essentially on top of her. She was still conscious though. It took almost an hour to extricate her safely, and for that hour I was assigned to doing manual stabilization of the spine. So I got a first-hand look as to how important it is to continually monitor the patient and provide them emotional support while you're holding their spine or while you're with them. Patients don't know what's going on. So having all these loud noises, all these bangs coming from the crushing metal when they're using the tools, all the smashing glass, everything is very scary to them, especially if they're in pain and or they can't move. So these are incredibly stressful times, and being able to explain what's happening on the scene is crucial. That's why we really need to do this hands-on training so that we know what's happening on the scene so we can tell our patients what's going on. So emotional support is huge, and also while you're at the head, you are able to easily monitor the patient. For example, that call that I was describing, that patient in the hour went from conscious, alert, relatively oriented to being unresponsive. So I was able to monitor her decline, and we were able to get a paramedic in there to start trying to treat her the best that he could with the car being on top of her. So it is a very important role being assigned to holding manual stabilization. Your job is to talk to that patient, get them through this process that they've never been through before and is very scary for them. So going back to traffic, which in case you can't tell, is a huge part of all of this. When you are arriving on scene, use your ambulance's lights to warn traffic that something is happening. So emergency lights are the first clue that something's happening. We should be slowing down. We should be very careful about driving around this area. Try to get flares, police officers, signs, something up as soon as possible. After that, usually police takes care of doing that other stuff, but if it's not going up, try to remind someone that, hey, we should probably have something to divert traffic around us, some more warning signs. If you do use flares, which every ambulance in New York State does carry 6 flares, it is required. So if you do use flares, make sure that you aren't putting it where there's spilled fuel. Flares do have fire, and fuel and fire don't mix very well, so make sure that we aren't using it around any combustibles. Also, don't use it in dry areas. So if you have a field that has a bunch of just dry vegetation in it, that flare can catch that field on fire. There's a very famous video of a police officer that's picking up flares and throwing them off the side of a cliff after a accident scene, and he started a wildfire because he threw it into dry vegetation and caught the entire field on the side of that road on fire after he threw it off that little cliff. So be mindful that it is fire we're dealing with, so don't just willy-nilly toss it away or light it near spilled fuel. So talking about airbags real quick, airbags are truly lifesavers. They are reducing the amount of serious injuries exponentially in MVA. So it used to be that if you were in a traffic accident, it was a very serious life threat most of the time. Now, most of the time, it's usually a very minor event. And a lot of that is thanks to airbags and also seatbelts. So when airbags go off, first off, it does hurt when it hits you. Airbags go very, very fast, and so your body will hurt when it actually gets slapped with the airbag. We get a lot of complaints of pain in the face and chest from an airbag hitting the patient. It also leaves a smoke in the vehicle, and so a lot of people will call and say, oh, there's smoke coming out of the vehicle must be on fire, when it's really just the powders coming from the airbag. Airbags have cornstarch and talcum powder usually in them, and that just helps keep the airbag intact while it's stored, and it allows it to freely inflate very fast. So those powders are meant to be there, but people will think that the vehicle's on fire because it looks like the big plume of smoke just came inside of the vehicle. If you come up on a vehicle that's been damaged and the airbag has not deployed, be very careful, because those things are very sensitive, and so just a little bit of movement of the vehicle, say if you're extricating the patient, that can discharge an airbag, and you do not want to be in an area that airbag is about to be discharged, because it, again, comes out with a lot of force and it can hurt. I'm sure you all know by now cars are designed to be safer than they were 20, 30, 40 years ago. Some of the safety features are having energy absorption factors in the front and back bumpers. A lot of the energy absorption comes in the form of a spring. So if you get in an accident and say your rear bumper got hit, the rear bumper is kind of on a spring, and you can press that spring. It's meant to bounce back out. So it transfers all the energy into a spring, and then the spring pushes back out, so the bumper returns back to a relatively normal spot. If you come up on a bumper and it's not pushed back out, that means the spring is still compressed, which means it can pop out randomly. So try not to walk directly behind a bumper that is pushed all the way in, because the spring can decompress and push that out into you, and it can take out your legs pretty easily. So spectators, the bane of my existence. MVAs elicit a lot of people coming out and wanting to see all the cool things that are happening. They want to see the blood and the gore. They want to see the fire department using the jaws of life. They want to watch everything that's going on. This turns into a lot of interference with our efforts. It also will cause a lot more traffic because people are going slow when they are doing what we call rubbernecking, where they are turning around to try to look at as much of the scene as possible. So if you can, try to use some sort of barrier to keep spectators away from the immediate danger of the scene and the operating areas of the scene. Police are usually good with this with police tape. They will put this up really quickly, especially if this is like a residential area where they will have a lot of people just manually walking around. So just keep spectators in mind, keep them away from the dangers that are happening, because if they get hurt, you might be found a little bit liable if you didn't take good measures to say, you need to stay away from this. This is a dangerous spot to be in. So just keep that in mind. So going into electrical hazards, that's a very common thing we see in MVAs, because we have utility poles, and cars will take the utility poles out. It will cause the wires to drop onto the ground or be suspended. So it's a very, very common thing to see. If you ever see wires suspended or on the ground, assume that they are energized. You have to assume that the entire area is unenergized. So even if it's not a primary line, it may be crossed with a primary electric line somewhere because of all the stuff that came down, and it could have gotten energized. So be very careful of this. We do not have the proper PPE to protect us against electrocution. This is not something that we as EMTs are messing with. So if you see a broken utility pole and you see wires down, you have to have a very large safety zone. Usually I like to say 2 poles behind the broken one. So you want one good pole, and then the next good pole is the start of your safety zone. So have a very large zone that responders and spectators or anyone else can avoid. When you find out which pole it is, if the fire department has an RA, contact your dispatch center and tell them to send the electric company and give them the pole location. There's usually a big number on the pole, and that's the pole number. So you can tell them this is the pole number, so that they know exactly where they're going to. And we don't mess around with electricity. This is something that we have to let the electric company or someone else who is properly trained handle before we can get into our patients. Even if the patient you can see is actively dying, if you approach them and you get electrocuted yourself, you're no help to anyone else. So vehicle fires, very, very dangerous situation. Typically, we don't want you ever approaching vehicle fires without proper equipment and proper PPE. That being said, if it's a small fire and you pull up and the patient just needs help being pulled out of the vehicle, use your best judgment. We do carry an ABC dry chemical fire extinguisher on the ambulance. Those will usually extinguish any type of fire. So it's meant to be kind of a catch-all for any source of fire, whether it's electrical or a typical burning object like the seats in a vehicle. It's usually meant to put out almost every fire. If there's a fire in the engine compartment, we aren't really trying to put that out. You only put that out if you open up the engine compartment fully, and usually that needs more than just the small fire extinguisher we have on the ambulance. That fire extinguisher is meant, number one, for a fire in your ambulance, but also if it's a small fire, say in the cabin of a vehicle and you need to get the patient out, you might use it in that situation. So if the fire is in the passenger compartment, try to spray it out as best as you can until you can get the occupants out. If it's in the trunk, usually just leave it sealed. That's the same thing as the front. Just leave it sealed, let someone with more power than you have with your little fire extinguisher put this out. If there is a fire under the vehicle, they want you to sweep underneath the passenger compartment. Again, that's something that really we should be leaving to the fire department. You need a lot more power and a lot more liquid behind that than what we carry with our little fire extinguisher. Keep in mind that the tires are very dangerous. It says truck tires, but really passenger tires are too, because if the tire gets too hot from the fire, it can expand all the air and the tires can explode. It explodes with a lot of force behind it. So keep that in mind. That's a very big danger that you are approaching when you're walking up to a car that's on fire. This is again why we generally don't want to be putting these fires out. This is just in the most extreme circumstances where you think you can put it out very quickly inside the passenger compartment and get the patient out. We kind of touched on this earlier, but there are a lot of electrical components in a vehicle nowadays, so that's why we turn the vehicle off. We take the keys out, we put them on the dash. The gold standard is removing the negative cable from the battery. Again, this is more of a fire department thing to do. We don't have the tools to be able to pop the hood and to take that negative cable off, but you might see the fire department doing this. As far as gaining access to your patient, just try to see if a door or window can be opened. Again, if their driver's side can't be open, try the other side, try the passenger side. There's the old phrase, try before you pry. So that means try all your points of entry before you actually force something open. If you can't easily get to the patient, that's where the fire department comes in with extrication, and so let them handle it. They have the proper tools, they have the proper training, they have proper PPE on, and they usually are breaking a lot of glass, which is something that we don't want to be around in just our normal uniform. So again, this is more fire department related, but when we have extrication, they follow generally a 3-part plan. So steps 1 and 2 of that 3-part plan is to gain access to the patient by disposing of the doors and the roof. So they cut the doors off, then cut the roof off. This makes the interior accessible and makes a very large exit for us to carry the patient out. If there was a fire, it provides fresh air and it keeps the air kind of cooler, and it helps us get very quick access to critical patients. Step 3 is getting the occupants out by displacing the front end. So this is where they are using a lot of very heavy duty tools and they're cutting away the front end of the vehicle to try to get the patient out. So again, this is more the fire department side. This is not something I'm going to be teaching you guys how to do, but we need to be aware of some of the things that they are doing just so that we can function well with them. All right, so going into some chapter review. So remember that highway precautions are very, very high risk. You need to be wearing your high visibility garments, such as a vest, and position the ambulance for blocking until someone relieves you of that duty. Remember to reduce the lighting that might blind passing drivers, so particularly those white lights, and avoid crossing traffic lanes with patients. Remember that the scene size up is a huge part of having the scene go well. So find out quickly how many patients are there and how sick are they, how bad are they right now. What additional resources resources do you need to take care of these patients? And again, scene safety is number one. So keep a lookout for every little danger that could possibly be on your scene. Remember to match the level of PPE being worn by other public safety responders. So if everyone is wearing something that you're not, it's a good idea to probably put that thing on. Make sure that if wires are down, that you stay back and your spectators stay back, and make sure that the vehicle is stable so it's not moving while we're working on it. Again, try your easiest method of access first. Try before you pry. And then if you do have to extricate your patient, remember to protect them during that process. So cover them up with something. Remember that highway response is a significant safety hazard for EMTs. Specific safety planning and procedures must be utilized to keep the responders safe. Remember that responding units should evaluate the need for further units, institute blocking to protect the work area, and always exit apparatus into the safe zone. Remember to use protective equipment and warning devices. And remember that vehicle extrication often requires specialized training and resources. Know your local resources and procedures. Remember to determine extrication resources needed and patient extrication priority through your scene size up. Again, scene size up is huge for these types of calls. Remember that extrication can pose a variety of threats. Evaluate the scene carefully and employ safety procedures. Remember, gaining access to patients frequently requires mechanical and technological assistance. Always start simply and escalate only when simple measures fail. When you pull up on scene, think, what is the best access for your unit? Where should you park your apparatus? And does the vehicle need to be stabilized? The highway crash you are dispatched to is a 7-car pileup. Your unit is first on scene. What steps are required that are different from those for a crash involving 1 car striking a tree? So first off, 7-car pileup, you probably need to shut down the road completely. You also have to focus heavily on additional resources. So find out how many patients you have, finding out how many people need to be extricated, find out how sick these patients are, how bad are their injuries. So we really need to focus on the scene size up a lot more than a 1-car striking a tree. So a lot of the stuff comes with some time and experience, and a lot of it is pretty obvious when you actually get out there and do it. So that brings us to the end of this chapter. Again, this goes very well when you actually have the hands-on practical portion, and it really does help build our interoperability between fire, EMS, and police to be training together doing all this stuff. So until next time.